Enjoy this tour of one of the scariest U.S. cases. Leave a comment with your viewing location before we begin. In 1917, a strange event occurred in the darkest Appalachians that will haunt a small North Carolina town. Early October that year. World War I was destroying Europe, but life went on in the Appalachian Mountains, not knowing what was happening across the Atlantic. North Carolina's mountains had thick fog, endless oak and pine forests, and small remote towns that lived off the land and each other. Winter brought a strange silence only mountaineers can understand. Silence seems to swallow all sounds and cries. Beatrice Lowe was 32 when last seen. She was famous for her skills in Madison County, near Marshall, herbal remedies and aids for midwives during difficult births. In those mountains, doctors were scarce, so women like Beatrice were the only ones who could help families with illnesses or births. She lived alone in a log cabin 2 miles from the road. A clearing with fir trees seemed to keep her secrets quiet. Beatrice's unmarried status was unusual for her age. As usual in small towns, rumors abounded. Some said she had. She was engaged as a child. Others whispered that she preferred mountain solitude to men. Everyone agreed on one thing. Beatrice was honest, quiet, and knew a lot about plants and medicines that seemed to have been passed down. Beatrice was supposed to help the Hutchkins with a difficult task on October 12, 1917, at their house 5 miles from her cabin. Sarah Hutchkins awaited her 4th child. 3 births were difficult. Tom, the family's 18-year-old oldest son, picked up Beatrice the day before. About 9 a.m., Thomas knocked on the cabin door. That October morning chill. Beatrice promised to arrive before noon the next day, but never did. Sarah Hutchkins' family was devastated when she gave birth in the afternoon of the 12th. Thomas returned to Beatrice's cabin to find the door ajar, swinging. Mountain wind blowing down. It looked fine inside. Made bed. The small pantry held jams and jellies. The fireplace wasn't lit, but firewood was nearby. Her instruments and medicine herbs were in a leather bag reese. It looked like she had packed up to leave on the table. Thomas called her. His voice was clear, but only the wind whistling through the fir trees could be heard. He looked right. Explored the area, going to the road and the small stream where Beatrice got her water. Nothing. She appeared to have vanished into the mountain air. Although Sarah was having trouble giving birth, the Hutchkins told their neighbors. Within 48 hours, most valley residents knew about the missing person. Madison County Sheriff Walter Grimes organized search parties. Criminal law was lax then. Investigate. No crime labs. Only big city residents knew about fingerprinting, and talking to people in other counties was slow and dangerous. For 5 days, men searched the mountains. They knew all rock-faced paths, canyons, and caves. Even natives can get lost in the Appalachian Mountains' many green paths. Nobody knew the land better than Beatrice. She grew up there and walked those paths in childhood. Her getting lost made no sense. One group found something scary on October 17th, the 5th day of searching. The group included 4 neighborhood men, including James Caldwell, a skilled hunter who knew the mountain's remote areas. They went higher than Beatrice usually did because James thought she went for a rare plant that only grew higher. Just over 4 miles from Beatrice's, they found a shawl in a cabin in the woods where the pines were so close they blocked out most of the sun. Beatrix's warm wrap. She had made a dark blue and gray woolen cloth 2 winters prior that everyone in the community knew. As if placed there, the shawl hung from a low oak branch 5 feet off the ground. The men were upset by the shawl's condition. It had multiple tiers. Missing fabric and dark stains that looked old but were hard to see in the dim forest light. Sheriff Grimes was informed immediately of the location. He went up with more men and bloodhounds the next day. The dogs took a while to find the trail after sniffing the shawl. They stopped to sniff the air and then turned around and went another way after a few yards. Beatrice's trail was everywhere and nowhere. 3 more days were needed to search that area. They found footprints, but the ground was so full of dry leaves and twigs that they couldn't tell if they were new or old or Beatrice's or a searcher's. The person had no clothes, no signs of a fight, and no blood on the ground or trees. The only sound was that torn shawl swinging. The branch appeared to be a mysterious message or warning. The days passed. People nearby whispered. Appalachians, especially remote ones, have always had stories. Legends about deep forest creatures have been passed down. Humans and animals that were neither. Human ghosts trapped between worlds after violent deaths. The elders discussed missing people from decades ago. People who disappeared into the woods. Sheriff Grimes rejected myths and magic. He was straightforward because mountain life was hard. However, years later, he told the Asheville Citizen that the case was odd, how the Shaw was found, how the dogs acted, and that Beatrice Lowe was missing. It felt like someone had taken her from that world and left no trace. The weeks after Beatrice Lowe disappeared, Madison County residents felt uneasy, like a thick fog from the mountains at dusk, getting darker. Soon, oak and maple leaves would turn red and gold and nighttime temperatures would drop sharply. The community couldn't ignore what happened. Beatrice was vital to the fragile social network that kept these people together in the wilderness. Appalachia. Sheriff Walter Grimes searched outside Madison County. He sent telegrams to nearby Buncombe, Yancey, and Haywood counties about Beatrice, and requested that they report any information immediately. Mountainous telegraph lines didn't always work, making communication difficult. Grimes persisted. From October to early November, he regularly communicated with other sheriffs and local authorities. At the same time, odd reports started appearing. Martha Hensley called the sheriff on October 23rd with a scary story. Within 8 miles of Beatrix's cabin, she lived in a valley. Martha reported waking up at 3 a.m. On October 11th, the night before she disappeared, she heard something from the mountains. The scream wasn't human or animal. It chilled her and kept her awake until dawn, listening to every sound, forest rustling near her house. Martha thought it was all in her head, so she never told anyone. It could have been a cougar or black bear, which are common there. She knew that mountain spot was almost where the sound came from that morning when she learned Beatrice was missing and where the Shaw was. Sheriff Grimes had meticulously recorded everything, but it didn't help. The mountain sounds weren't strange, it wasn't common, and there wasn't any proof, so this was another piece of an impossible puzzle. Some shared their stories. The night of October 12th, Hunter Eugene Phelps saw strange lights in the woods. Strange lights moved in the trees and up and down the slopes like they had minds. 2 brothers named Reeves left strange footprints in the creek, according to fishermen. Tracks too large for humans and unrecognizable to animals. The sheriff investigated each report, but when he arrived, he found only normal wildlife. Beatrice's cabin was examined. Sheriff Grimes and 2 deputies searched every corner, trunk, and shelf all day. They searched through letters, diaries, and other documents to figure out what happened or who Beatrice was running with. They found a simple, well-run life. A small book was there, where she recorded medicine recipes, herb combinations for various health issues, and tincture and picus instructions. The personal diary had few, unremarkable entries. Beatrix last wrote in her diary on October 10th, 2 days before she disappeared. Her letter mentioned the cold and the need to gather herbs before winter. The Hutchkins family alerted them to Sarah's impending birth. Nothing was strange, and no fears were expressed. No threats or worries, just a mountain woman preparing for winter. The coins in Beatrice's ceramic jar were worth $15 at the time. Old letters to a sister in Knoxville, Tennessee, were also found. Sheriff called Sister Elizabeth Crowder by telegram. It had been almost 2 months since Beatrice wrote to her in late August. Elizabeth visited north. Carolina arrived in Marshall in early November after hearing she was missing. Elizabeth was 5 years older than Beatrice and had a battle-worn face. She told the sheriff they both lost their parents as children. She said Elizabeth married and moved to Tennessee, while Beatrice stayed in the North Carolina mountains. They often wrote, but it had been over 3 years since they had met. Elizabeth couldn't visualize. Her sister may have endured. Beatrice was careful because she knew the mountains were dangerous and how to avoid wild animals and bad weather. When Elizabeth arrived, the case changed. Sheriff Grimes let her help search because it was her right as a sister to find her brother. Elizabeth searched the same paths as the men, climbed to the Shaw's location, and looked inside Beatrix's cabin. Very familiar with her sister's actions. She noticed Beatrice didn't wear her small medallion, which the others missed. A simple silver locket held a faded photo of both parents. It was always on for Beatrice. Elizabeth says she wore it day and night. She had few things that reminded her of her deceased parents. Liz searched every drawer and nook in the cabin for it. Nothing. A locket. Beatrice and friends vanished. Since Elizabeth said Beatrice usually took it off to sleep, she was wearing it when she disappeared, so she wasn't asleep. Sheriff Grimes's view of time changed after this small discovery. Beatrice was likely awake and dressed when she disappeared if she was wearing the medallion. Why did she take her medical bag out of the house? Behind? What was wrong with the door? Why wasn't it locked? Beatrice was watchful. Everything agreed that she would not leave her house alone without a pressing reason. November saw its first snowfall. A white blanket over the Appalachians made the search harder and more dangerous. Because they had to take care of their families and prepare for winter, community men traveled less. Sheriff Grimes investigated anyway. Officially open, but even he knew the odds of finding Beatrice alive were decreasing daily. Elizabeth stayed until mid-November. She traveled the mountains and spoke to everyone who knew Beatrice to learn more about her sister's last days. She discovered something interesting during these talks. Old woman Agnes Porter lived in a cabin even farther away than Beatrix. She mentioned seeing Beatrice a week before she disappeared on October 5th. Beatrice brought Agnes arthritis medicine to her cabin, she said. Beatrice told the visitor she saw a strange man in the woods days earlier. It was odd because Beatrice knew almost everyone in that mountainous area. The man watched from a side trail. He turned around and disappeared into the trees without saying hello when Beatrice approached. Word. Agnes said Beatrice didn't think much of the event. She said the man's look, as if he were studying or measuring her, was disturbing. Agnes didn't care much about the story because Beatrice seemed more interested in who this stranger was. Since the person was missing, the meeting became more sinister. Sheriff Grimes tried. Determine what this strange man is. He asked every house within 15 miles if anyone had visitors or saw strange people. No one knew anything useful. Travelers, sellers, and seasonal workers looking for work in the lumber mills were always on the main roads, but none fit Beatrice's vague description of Agnes. An average-sized man in dark clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that covered his face in winter 1917. That the North Carolina Appalachians were worst. The snow was thick. The trails were impassable. So many families were stuck on their land until spring. Everyone was still thinking about Beatrice Lowe, but the community had to focus on staying warm in the winter. Elizabeth Crowder returned to Tennessee late November. She carried her sister's belongings and a heavy heart. Always had her. She promised Sheriff Grimes to keep investigating the case as long as spring allowed before leaving. Grimes was known for keeping his word. That cold winter brought strange events. Locals began recounting scary dreams. A local tragedy usually affected everyone in a small town, but this one was different. Strange how consistent these reports are. Unrelated people reported having similar dreams about Beatrice's Shaw's forest. One of these was Dorothy Mingus, married to a local farmer. She told her neighbor, who told others, that she continued to dream of Beatrice walking through the forest in the same direction, always up the mountain to the highest and most remote places. In dream, Dorothy never knew what Beatrice was after. Her mornings started in the same place, rushed and scared. She calmed down after hours. Another lumberjack in the county's forests, Samuel Garrett, dreamed he heard Beatrix's voice calling for help from the mountains, as if she were buried there. These accounts heightened unease despite not aiding investigations. Spread throughout. Beatrice Lowe disappeared. No longer remained a crime. Everyone in the community saw it as a wound. In 1918, spring brought Thor and new plants to England. Sheriff Grimes asked volunteers, including some who hadn't been on the previous fall's expeditions, to search again in hopes of finding something new. A thorough search was planned, going beyond previously searched areas and into distant ones. Another disturbing find was made on April 28, 1918, during a spring expedition. 5 men, led by experienced hunter Harold Blackwood, explored an area 6 miles from Beatrix's cabin. They were headed away from the Shaw. It had rough, rocky terrain, and many small caves formed naturally over thousands of years by. The erosion of that mountain range is limestone. One of these caves was too small to be called a grotto, but large enough for a person to bend over and find something strange. Despite being wet and worn down, the cloth bag was still recognizable. A woman owned the items inside. Bone combs, hairpins, scarf-like fabric, and something that made all the men stop and stare were there. Many women then used a small prayer book. The book was damp and musty. Name and date in faded but readable ink were on the back cover. 1893. The pages stuck. Men immediately took the bag to Sheriff Grimes. He carefully examined the items and suspected he had found more than Beatrice Lowe's disappearance. The community had never heard of Clara Ara Whitfield, but Grimes was careful. Interested in county data. For several days, he sorted through the Marshall County office's old files. He learned disturbing things. Clara Whitfield, 27, disappeared in September 1893, 24 years before Beatrix. Records were scarce. Sheriff Thomas Briggs, who had died years earlier, kept a logbook with a few entries. Clara Ara left home one afternoon to pick berries and never returned, according to these records. A. We searched for her but found nothing. It was impossible to ignore the similarities between the cases. In the same mountain area, 2 women disappeared over 20 years apart. None left significant clues. Finding Clara's bag in that small cave was scary. Did she hide there? She was taken there? Why wasn't that bag found? The 1893 searches led Grimes to learn more about his research. He sought older records, talking to local seniors who can recall decades-old events. Something coldened his blood. Others did this besides Clara Whitfield. There were other disappearances. At 80, Josiah Mercer lived in a small house outside Marshall. He told the sheriff about Rebecca Hayes, who disappeared around 1876 or 1877 when he was young. He wasn't sure what happened, but he remembered that the community had been searching for her for weeks without success. She disappeared as she moved between properties. Someone mentioned Margaret Sullivan, a young woman who disappeared after 1862. Grimes discovered more cases from local history as he investigated. Not all had good data. Many were just stories passed down from generation to generation. A troubling pattern emerged. They were all women. The Appalachian Mountains in Madison County were where they all disappeared. They all vanished without a trace. No bodies or reasonable explanations were found. Time between disappearances varied from years to decades. However, a frightening pattern emerged. Grimes compiled all the old case information he could find. Writing down every event created a simple timeline. He could prove she was missing with reliable records or testimony. A series of tragedies spanning at least 60 years and possibly longer unfolded. The mountains seemed uninhabited by women. Rumors about Grimes's discoveries upset the community. The mountains they had always called home made people uneasy. Older people's monster and ghost stories. Winter nights made the idea seem reasonable. In those old forests, something had been there for generations, but no one could explain. Realism prevented Sheriff Grimes from giving in to superstitions. He believed there was a logical explanation, such as a long-time criminal or a series of devastating natural disasters, but he struggled to explain how so many women could disappear without a trace, no bodies, and no evidence after years. He decided to research more. He wrote to nearby counties asking if they knew of any similar disappearances. The answers took weeks to arrive, but they both deepened and clarified the mystery. There were a few cases like this in nearby counties, but enough to show no pattern. Limited to Madison County. In October 1917, Sheriff Walter Grimes began searching for Beatrice Lowe, but his investigation quickly expanded. What started as a search for a missing woman became a journey through the area's history, revealing a multi-generational disappearance pattern. More and more scary implications emerged as he dug deeper. Grimes spent most of 1918's summer. He had time for this larger investigation. He visited nearby counties, searched libraries and courthouses for old records, and interviewed retired sheriffs and older people with decades-old memories. Though fragmented, the picture was consistent enough to be unsettling. He found records of 3 women who disappeared in remote mountain areas over 50 years in Buncombe County. This happened twice in Yancey County. In Haywood County, he found 4 cases, including Madison County ones, on record. It was believed that 18 women had disappeared in the Appalachian Mountains over 70 years. 18 women. Some were young, old, some were married, others not. Not everyone had kids, but they shared some things. They were last seen in rural and mountainous areas. None of them were caught after disappearing without a trace. The body improved. Statistics showed that wild animals and natural disasters were unlikely to kill them all. Something else occurred. Grimes had to find more victim connections. He made lengthy lists of their names, estimated ages, disappearance dates, locations, and any other information he could find. He examined the dates to see if the disappearances occurred at certain times. Most occurred in warmer months, from April to October, when people had more outdoor time and mountain trails were easier to reach. Many missing women were linked to traditional knowledge, he said. He discovered from old records that Clara Whitfield made baskets and found the best natural resources. Margaret Sullivan was a midwife. Rebecca Hayes dyed fabrics with local plants. Naturally, Beatrice was a healer who knew a lot about healing herbs. All victims don't fit this pattern, but many did. Many women had hiked in the mountains and forests. Early in August 1918, Grimes received a letter that changed his investigation again. Nathaniel Pemberton, an Asheville historian, heard about the sheriff's research from other historians. Pemberton loved Appalachian folklore, spent years collecting mountain community stories and oral histories. Pemberton wrote in the letter that Grimes's stories resembled local tales he had collected over the years. He invited the sheriff to Asheville to show him some records and stories that could aid the investigation. Grimes went on the trip even though he wasn't sure folklore would help the investigation. He was willing to investigate the chance. Asheville grew in 1918. It was larger and more developed than Madison County's small towns. Grimes took the train through beautiful mountain scenery for several hours. He found Pemberton in a small back room of the Asheville Public Library, surrounded by yellowed books, notebooks, and papers. In his 50s, Nathaniel Pemberton was thin and hard-looking. He had gray hair and ink-stained hands from writing. He welcomed Grimes, kept his cool, and displayed his materials immediately. He collected interesting Appalachian oral stories from generations past. Many of these stories were about dangerous or cursed mountain spots where people had gone missing. Strange lights were seen, and animals behaved strangely. Pemberton mapped these places using the stories' descriptions. When he saw his map with Grimes' missing person bodies overlapped, Grimes liked one story. Before the Trail of Tears in 1838, Cherokees lived there and told the story. This story claimed that some mountain valleys were the border between the living world and a dangerous, unnamed place. These were not Cherokee campsites, performed rituals to protect themselves when crossing them. Pemberton said the old Cherokee man who told him the story hid his family in the mountains after their people were taken against their will. The man Pemberton only knew as Thomas of Little Creek told him his ancestors had talked about going into imaginary valleys and sometimes getting lost. They were lost between worlds and couldn't return, not eaten by monsters or killed by evil spirits. Return fully to life. Grimes took in everything with curiosity and doubt. He needed facts, not legends, as a police officer, but he couldn't deny that these stories had something in common with the strange pattern he'd found. Pemberton showed Grimes other papers, such as accounts written by missionaries who had worked with the women and how they just disappeared, as if they had crossed an invisible line and couldn't come back. In the early 1800s, these missionaries sometimes wrote to their Eastern churches about how nervous the people were about certain mountain areas. In 1827, a missionary named Reverend Jonathan Aldridge wrote about a woman in a congregation who swore that women should not walk certain trails alone because there was something in the woods that would not let people leave. The sheriff was in Asheville for 2 full days, reading Pemberton's files. After returning to Marshall, his view of the case changed slightly but significantly. Though he wasn't ready for supernatural explanations, he had to admit that this mystery was more than a modern criminal case. It was historically and culturally rich. Back in Madison County, Grimes tried something new. He met with the area's oldest residents, whose families had lived in the mountains for generations. He meant to. Listen to them discuss dangerous places, stories from their grandparents and great-grandparents, and hiking safety. The Marshall Methodist Church hosted the September afternoon meeting. Most of the 20 attendees were over 60. They initially avoided discussing these issues. Superstitions were frowned upon, especially by those who wanted to appear sophisticated. But Grimes took it seriously, so they slowly started talking about it, which helped. Esther McCain, an 80-year-old woman, said her grandmother told her not to follow nighttime woods lights because they weren't human flashlights but were trying to scare people off safe trails. Other man, William Tate, said his father taught him whistles to make when entering certain woods to politely alert others. Presents to any inhabitants. The Marshall's Methodist Church meeting illuminated a part of the case. Sheriff Walter Grimes had never considered. Not just nonsense or superstitions. They were passed down from generation to generation based on decades or centuries of real-life experiences and observations. Nearby mountain dwellers were sensible. How to navigate both physical terrain and something more vague and difficult to describe in some places. After 73 years, Isaiah Fletcher told one of the most detailed stories. His family lived there before the Civil War. Isaiah accurately described 3 mountain valleys around Marshall that his family avoided. He wasn't sure why these valleys were problematic. Father told son, mother told daughter, something was wrong with those places. The most disturbing part was that Isaiah's descriptions matched missing people's locations. Beatrix's shawl was found on a valley edge. Clara Ara Whitfield's purse was found in another cave. It wasn't always an accident, but it was impossible to ignore the steady overlap. Isaiah also said something that made Grimes rethink his investigation plan. He said his grandfather, who lived to be 92 and died in 1889, talked about missing people before Europeans arrived. Isaiah's grandfather told how the Cherokee knew those valleys were dangerous and had stories about people who went there, never returned. If so, the disappearances must not have begun with European settlers. It was much older and rooted in mountain geography and nature. Grimes began to suspect that he was investigating something other than a human crime. In autumn 1918, the world was dealing with the last months of World War I and the Spanish flu. Epidemic, Grimes continued his thorough investigation. He began mapping the landscapes of the missing places to find geological features common to all of them. Did the rock have caves, fish, or strange formations? Could soil minerals cause strange things? He spoke to a local mining company geologist. Edward Moss, a young geologist, was fascinated by the puzzle. He regarded. Grimes' maps showed that some trouble spots were linked to old rock formations. Where different types of rock met, Moss called these geological transition zones. He believed they might have magnetic or mineral properties that could change people's behavior or make them feel lost. Though intriguing, the idea didn't explain the pattern. Lost people may not know where to go, but where were the corpses? Through those years with So, were no bodies found? Missing people were numerous. Hunters or forest workers would find an exposed or accident victim in a remote area. Nothing, though. Only occasional items like Clarara's purse and Beatrix's shawl. Grimes learned Beatrix's sister Elizabeth Crowder was very ill in Tennessee in November. Knoxville had the Spanish flu, and Elizabeth got sick. On November 18th, she died. 1918. She had no idea what happened to her sister. Grimes felt this loss deeply. Elizabeth left after he promised to keep his word. She went hoping to find answers. Winter was harsh again, so physical searches were halted. Grimes researched his documentary during winter. He spent hours in his office by lamplight gathering case information. It seemed he was obsessed. Could find. Martha worried about her husband because the mystery consumed him, but she knew Walter could not leave questions unanswered. Grimes noticed something odd in his records. Recent disappearances followed a vague timeline. The disappearances occurred every 710 years, but not always simultaneously. Clara was born in 1893, 24 years before Beatrice in 1917. Before Clara. Sarah Drummond in 1885, 8 years earlier. 8 years earlier, Rebecca Hayes in 1877. As far back as his records allowed, this temporal pattern persisted with variations. Some years had multiple disappearances or longer periods without incidents. But the regularity suggested something more than randomness. The phenomenon seemed to have a cycle or periodicity. Grimes demonstrated. Temporal analysis, to Nathaniel Pemberton, during his February 1919 return to Asheville. Peyton was intrigued and noted that some folklore practices had temporal cycles related to supernatural phenomena. Some cultures believed the worlds became more permeable at times. Peyton may have thought such things were happening in those mountains. The historian informed Grimes of his latest discovery. He found a record in a 1762 French explorer's Appalachian journals were preserved by Charleston's Historical Society. Antoine, an explorer, wrote about Cherokee tales of time-bending mountains. People would enter these places at dawn and leave thinking it was only an hour, but it was late. Or they would enter for a few minutes and realize it was already past. Ancient accounts, possibly exaggerated or misinterpreted across languages and cultures. Grimes couldn't help but wonder if the language and understanding of the time were describing a real phenomenon. Albert Einstein helped modern physics explore strange concepts of space and time. Could natural laws differ elsewhere? Grimes organized in spring 1919. Last comprehensive expedition. He wanted to thoroughly investigate Isaiah Fletcher's 3 problematic valleys. He planned several week-long expeditions with 10 experienced mountaineers. They would bring camping gear, enough food, and a set of simple instruments from geologist Edward Moss, including compasses and a magnetic field meter. The first expedition started April 22nd. The group entered the valley where Beatrice Lowe was found almost 18 months earlier. They explored every ravine, rock formation, and small cave for 3 days. They meticulously recorded unusual events, compass readings, vegetation, and geology. What they found was subtle but disturbing. Compasses behaved erratically in 5/100 m diameter areas. Needles rotated slowly, as if unable to point magnetic north. Compasses pointed slightly differently in some places. Although not dramatic, it was consistent and repeatable. That first expedition in April 1919 found the first physical evidence of something unusual in those mountains: magnetic anomalies. Sheriff Walter Grimes was pleased and uneasy. He finally had something concrete, something measurable and documented. However, magnetic anomalies alone could not explain the disappearance of 18 women over decades, deepening the mystery. The second expedition included geologist Edward Moss. He brought more gear and measured for days. He concluded that the subsurface mineral composition in those areas was unusual. He found abundant magnetite and other minerals. He found magnetic interference pockets in ferrous minerals. Moss said these formations could confuse compass users, but Grimes pointed out the obvious flaw in this explanation. The missing women didn't use compasses. Locals used natural landmarks, the sun's position and terrain knowledge to navigate the mountains. Beatrice Lowe spent her entire life here. Life. How could magnetic anomalies explain her disappearance? She didn't need instruments to navigate. Moss acknowledged he was stumped. He believed intense or irregular magnetic fields could affect the brain in subtle ways that science had yet to discover. He said preliminary studies suggested intense magnetism could affect perception and cause strange sensations. However, these were theories without evidence. Solid proof. Something happened during the third expedition in May that heightened the investigation. Robert Swain, an experienced hunter, became separated from the group while exploring a dense field. He became profoundly disoriented about 50 meters from the group, still within hearing distance. Although he later described it as feeling like the ground had tilted beneath him, everything looked normal. He held on to a tree to avoid falling. The intense feeling lasted only a few seconds but frightened him. He thought his voice sounded like he was shouting through a tunnel when he called out to the others. The other men immediately came toward him, but Robert swore their voices sounded much farther away. He was pale and trembling when they arrived. Grimes marked the spot precisely, where Robert felt it. Additional measurements were taken. At that location, compasses slowly rotated in complete circles, causing erratic magnetic readings. Moss believed Robert had passed through a focal point of high magnetic intensity, which may have affected his balance and spatial perception. There was more to Robert's story than physical disorientation. His words. He saw something briefly in those dizzying seconds. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't a creature or person, but it was as if the space around him had become transparent or translucent, allowing him to see through reality to something parallel to it. It passed before he could focus, but it was real enough to disturb him. Other men grew agitated afterward. Some questioned the wisdom of continuing these expeditions. They began to suspect that they were tampering with something important, and that these places were avoided for ancient reasons. Grimes had to exert his authority and persuasion to keep the group together and explore. Other two valleys identified by Isaiah Fletcher were explored over the next few weeks. Similar magnetic anomalies and spots were found. A dense or charged atmosphere was hard to describe. They found another small cave in one of the valleys with ancient objects, Cherokee pottery fragments, a rusted metal comb, and deteriorated cloth that was impossible to identify. Grimes sent Asheville samples of the found objects for analysis. The textile results were inconclusive, but dating the pottery to 200 years ago confirms early Cherokee presence in those areas. This supported claims that these places were known and avoided before European settlers arrived. Grimes wrote a detailed report in June 1919. Over 50 pages detailed the disappearances, expeditions, physical discoveries, and theories chronologically. State officials, the North Carolina Historical Society, and others received copies. Academic institutions interested in the case. Responses varied. A few recipients dismissed the report as superstition and coincidence. Others offered academic interest but no resources or help. A University of North Carolina physics professor wrote a long, thoughtful letter discussing theoretical possibilities related to magnetic fields and human perception, but admitting that science lacked the tools to investigate such phenomena. The most intriguing response came from an unexpected source. A letter from Washington was signed Colonel James Whitmore. Whitmore wrote on unmarked paper, but had an authoritative tone. He praised Grimes' meticulous report and noted that similar patterns had been observed elsewhere in the U.S., but rarely so systematically. Whitmore requested permission to visit and examined the identified regions. Although he didn't identify himself or his authority, his letter suggested official knowledge and access to information the public didn't have. Grimes agreed to the visit, curious and hoping federal resources would be available for a deeper investigation. Colonel Whitmore arrived at Marshall in July with two unnamed assistants, young, silent, and observant. Men packing equipment into number-only boxes. Whitmore was a middle-aged man with short military hair and a precise economical speech. After reviewing Grimes's records and asking many questions, he demanded to visit each of the three troubled valleys alone. Over 5 days, Whitmore and his helpers walked around and measured things using tools Grimes had never seen. They worked quietly and quickly, putting information in hidden notebooks. The colonel blocked Grimes from telling Whitmore about his findings, saying he needed to collect and analyze the data first. Whitmore spoke to Grimes alone at the sheriff's office the night before leaving. Strange and upsetting things were said. Whitmore said there were a few places in the world, not many, but enough for people to notice, for things to work differently. He didn't use supernatural or paranormal, but he did discuss strange geological features, transition zones, and things science didn't yet name. He told Grimes that the disappearances were real and sad, but they would likely never be solved. Whitmore claimed that forces larger than local police or scientists were at play. Grimes's best feature. Could do, the colonel said, was write down what he found, keep the papers safe, and, most importantly, teach the locals what to avoid. Sheriff Walter Grimes was left with more questions than answers after Colonel Whitmore left. He considered the colonel's words and tone for days after their last conversation, trying to understand them. Whitmore kept much of what he knew from everyone for unknown reasons, kept that info private. Grimes had touched the edge of something bigger that went beyond those North Carolina mountains, and may have had something to do with the federal government in ways he didn't understand. Grimes focused on education and prevention after Whitmore advised him. He could try to stop more women from going missing if he couldn't explain what was happening or find the women who were missing. He held meetings in Madison County towns in the summer and fall of 1919 to warn solo travelers to avoid certain mountain areas. People reacted differently. Some residents, especially older people who have traditions about avoiding certain places, were glad the government agreed. Others, particularly younger residents or recent arrivals, doubted Grimes' warnings, superstition that appears official. But he persisted. He supported his claims with his sheriff title. Grimes created unofficial monitoring systems with community leaders. Mountain hikers should notify their neighbors, never hike alone in remote areas, and pay extra attention to the 3 valleys he identified as dangerous. Irrational fear didn't drive these simple, useful steps, practically identifying unidentified risks. The months passed. No missing persons were reported from winter 1919 to 1922. After that, spring went smoothly. Grimes hoped his precautions were working, or that the mysterious disappearances had stopped to be safe. But he stayed alert, updated his records, and talked to the older residents, continuously seeking new historical information. Strange things happened in May 1922. Dorothy Ashford came from Tennessee to talk to Grimes at his house. Dorothy was in her 40s and looked worn from her mountain life. Her eyes held a story she wanted to tell. She said she knew about Grimes's investigations from people they knew and had useful information. Dorothy's tale was captivating. She said she and her family lived in a remote Tennessee town near North Carolina when she was 15. She collected chestnuts in a forest near her house in October. She knew that spot well. She was a frequent visitor. But something odd happened that afternoon. As Robert Swain described in the Grimes case, she suddenly experienced severe dizziness while walking on a familiar trail, going on trips. Dorothy thought the world was moving, like she was looking through water. She sat on the ground because she was afraid to stand. She wasn't sure, but they felt like passing out for 30 seconds. She felt an overwhelming need to leave immediately afterward. Dorothy ran home scarred but unharmed. She kept the event a secret to avoid ridicule or illness. What happened left a lasting impression, and she heard about missing women in the western mountains years later. She wondered if what she saw and heard was related. Maybe she was close, but escaped by chance. Grimes focused on Dorothy's tale. He asked many questions about the crime scene. Details of what happened and anything else she remembered. He checked his maps and found that Dorothy's place was in Madison County's troubled geological formations. This proved that the event was widespread across the Appalachian Peninsula. Dorothy also said something Grimes valued. She briefly felt like she could just fly when she had vertigo and the world seemed to shake, move any direction to get somewhere else. Not geographically different, but fundamentally different, as if she could easily choose a door and walk through it. She remembered the emotion years later because it was so strong. After Dorothy left, Grimes pondered her words for days. It was the first-person account of a similar experience to what he thought the missing women had, who endured much but survived. Dorothy's invisible door story resembled ancient Cherokee tales of borderlands between worlds. A coherent thread ran through different times and sources. Grimes took one last personal trip to the Three Valleys that summer. He didn't bring many people this time. Instead, he brought 2 trusted men. They moved slowly, never more than a few meters apart, making eye contact. He wanted to return to these places to notice the small feelings he missed while measuring and writing down. He discovered that paying close, calm attention to those places allowed him to feel something. Though not as exciting as Robert or Dorothy's intense dizziness, the air had a quality, pressure, or density that wasn't found in other parts of the mountains. It felt like somewhere, where the sky was clear, but the air was tense before a storm. His 2 friends said they felt the same, but neither could say what. Grimes sometimes thought sounds behaved strangely. It seemed like a 10-meter voice was 20 meters away, or vice versa. Perhaps something far away was surprisingly close. If you listened closely, you could hear it even though it changed constantly, thought this might be. The acoustic distortion was part of the same event, whether it was related to magnetic anomalies or not. Grimes reported again in September 1920, more personal and introspective than the first. He didn't send it to the government or school. He asked the county clerk to keep it as a historical record this time to avoid confusion. He recorded facts, findings, and his own thoughts in this report on what his research meant. He wrote about how the investigation humbled him by showing him that human law and science could not explain or control everything. He described the 18 lost women as real people with hopes, dreams, and loved ones. He regretted that he couldn't find the bodies or explain what happened to give the families peace of mind. But he wrote about hope. Hope that by carefully writing everything down, he was creating a resource for future generations when science might have improved and understood what he couldn't. Hope that his preventative measures would save lives, even if he didn't know how many. Hope you can be honest and brave about mysteries even if they can't be solved. The years after Walter Grimes's second report were always alert, but there was also a gradually realizing some mysteries are unsolvable by humans. Daniel Whitlock, 7 years younger than the sheriff, took over in 1926 after he retired at 63. Grimes briefed Whitlock on the case for weeks before leaving office. He showed him all the records and took him to the 3 troubled valleys to share his years of research and knowledge. As sheriff after 1920, Grimes oversaw no. In his advised areas, more people disappeared. Some community members believed his precautions and relentless warnings caused this. Some believed the strange cycle ended spontaneously. Grimes did not claim credit or offer many theories. He monitored things and talked to locals to update his maps and conversations. Asheville historian Nathaniel Peaton continued his own project. He and Grimes continued. Regular letters about their discoveries and innovations. Peaton had conducted research in other Appalachian and U.S. mountain ranges. He found less-known patterns in the Colorado Rockies and Washington State's Cascade Mountains. Always in remote areas with strange geology, and always unexplained disappearances lasting decades or centuries. Peaton wrote the serious 1923 book Anomalous, American Appalachian Geography Events. Academically sound, it respected Grimes's work and discoveries and followed rules. Folklore experts, adventurous geologists, and mystery fans liked the book, but it didn't garner academic attention. Peaton avoided shocking with the information. His tone was always serious investigation and respect for the victims. The book validated Grimes's work. From across the country, people who had seen or heard of similar events or lived in new areas where people had disappeared wrote letters. One northern Maine man wrote about a place in the woods where hunters wouldn't go, compasses spun aimlessly, and mysterious disappearances date back to colonial times. A Western Virginia woman described the lost place, a valley where 3 people died. It had been 50 years since people appeared. Grimes personally answered each letter, sharing what he learned, offering advice on avoiding problems, and encouraging good records. He became an unofficial expert on these topics without trying. Locals with similar mysteries asked for his help. He helped however he could and stressed respecting victims, being careful when exploring, and being humble when facing. The Unknown. A 1925 article by geologist Edward Moss, who helped with the first expeditions, described strange magnetic events in Madison County mountains. His paper was technical and only discussed geological measurements, not disappearances or strange events that can't be explained, but it confirmed that these rock formations were strange and needed more research. People read Moss's paper. Little, but crucial. Geologists want to visit and measure the area. Grimes, who was still sheriff, helped arrange some of these visits, but only if the scientists followed safety rules and heeded danger signs. Scientific expeditions confirmed Moss's findings but couldn't explain the strange things they saw. These were measurable events, but they stayed on the edge. The geology of the time may explain it. Grimes and Martha moved to a smaller Madison County house near Marshall during 1926. In retirement, he wasn't lazy. He spent his days putting his case files back in order, writing detailed accounts of his investigation, and writing letters to Peyton and other people who were interested in the mystery. It kept him connected to his lifelong work. Once, in 1928, sound the alarm. A young woman, Helene Morrison, disappeared while walking between rural properties in the county. Everyone in the community feared the old pattern was returning immediately. Daniel Whitlock, the new sheriff, followed Grimes' rules to search widely. Whitlock gratefully accepted Grimes' retired help. It took 5 days to search. 6 days after disappearing, Helen was found 15 kilometers away. She was still alive, but she was lost and not hurt. Because her story was about getting lost, walking in circles, and not finding familiar landmarks, it was hard to follow. Her body was fine, but she was scared and tired. Another important thing was that the place she got lost did not match any of Grimes' 3 troubled valleys. Someone just got lost in rough terrain. People in the community could feel their relief. Helen's recovery, and how it's easy to understand. The disappearance raised hopes that the strange event was over. After Helen recovered, Grimes visited her and gently discussed her ordeal. Even mountain experts can be fooled. He knew the difference between normal loss and the mysterious disappearances he was investigating. Madison County slowly modernized in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Roads improved, and cars. Phone lines became more common in remote areas. Distances shrank and communication improved. Some children thought stories about dangerous valleys were old superstitions or scary stories their grandparents told them that didn't apply to today's world as they became more connected. Older people who remembered were cautious. Still, they avoided some places and warned their children and grandchildren not to go. Grimes discussed with Peyton how information was passed down and how stories and oral tradition preserved some lessons even when the full meaning was lost. The Dangerous Valley stories were full of useful information hidden in stories. A short illness killed Martha Grimes in 1932. Walter was depressed. After 41 years of marriage, she was his constant friend and support during the hard times. Investigate. Grimes spent more time alone at home, reading his records and remembering after Martha died. He wrote his last case-related piece during this sad time. It was over 200 handwritten pages and included a personal story and a complete investigation. He called it The Mystery of the Valleys, and it took 40 years to investigate. It was meant to be read in its entirety, not published. His last written account of the case's events, thoughts, and feelings. After decades of research, deep thought, and thought about one of the Appalachian Mountains' most perplexing mysteries, Walter Grimes completed the manuscript in 1933. His boxes of records, maps, letters, and photos from years at the local historical society were turned in with the paper. He believed he had done everything possible. He wrote as much as he could about the inexplicable so future generations could continue. Nathaniel Peaton visited Grimes in spring 1934. Historians also aged. He was slower and had white hair, but his mind was sharp. After several days of touring important sites, the two men resumed talking about old things and pondering their meaning. Peaton revealed a secret during this visit, kept secret for years. Grimes learned that Colonel Whitmore, the 1919 curious visitor, called Peaton a few months after his Madison County visit. Whitmore requested that the historian keep some things private. Peaton thought he could share it since the colonel was probably dead or retired after 15 years. Whitmore claimed he worked for a secret federal agency that investigated unexplained natural events in the U.S. What Whitmore says: about 37 places in the U.S. had officially recorded strange events like those in Madison County valleys. Some were in other terrain, but many were in remote mountains. All of them had magnetic or geological anomalies that could be measured, long-standing stories about how dangerous or cursed the area was, and a pattern of people going missing for decades or centuries. Whitmore blamed the government. Through Peaton, couldn't explain these sites. There was no official program or public recognition of them, but they were quietly observed and studied when possible. Simple to grasp, they could not be removed or changed, and making them famous would only scare or lead curious people to dangerous places. The best strategy was to keep quiet, keep records, and gently warn people not to enter these areas. Grimes heard this, revelation that validates and frustrates. On the one hand, it proved that he wasn't crazy and that what he had looked into was real and known even by the government's top leaders. However, knowing that the federal government's resources couldn't solve the mystery made him feel even more helpless. It would be risky in valleys. The strange event may never be explained. Whitmore's theory was also discussed by Peaton. Cautiously, the colonel thought these might be places with slightly distorted space structures, not drastically like in science fiction, but enough to have measurable effects and sometimes let people accidentally fall through reality cracks. Whitey didn't know their destination. Maybe they stopped existing and their molecules spread into another dimension. They may have gone to a similar place, the world, but is inaccessible and confusing. This crazy idea was hard to consider. However, Grimes couldn't ignore it. He saw the strange things, felt the strange places, and heard the same story from generations of sources. If reality allowed such places, it was impossible to know what was possible or impossible. After Peaton left, Grimes contemplated for weeks. He could feel it in his bones at 81. He knew his time was limited. He contemplated what to say on his deathbed about the case that consumed his life. He wrote an open letter to be read 50 years after his death. Grimes brutally honest about what he found in this letter, which he gave county officials with clear instructions on when to open. His emotions and hopes. He couldn't solve the mystery, find the missing women, or satisfy the grieving families. He also advised being brave in the unknown, honestly recording the inexplicable, and respecting human understanding while pushing it. Beatrice Lowe's disappearance started his investigation, so he wrote about her. He discussed how her memory haunted him for years. He sometimes dreamed she was walking through the mountains, always up and toward something he couldn't see. He wrote that he hoped she was at peace. Grimes was peaceful in his later years. He lived in a small Marshall house, receiving visitors and writing few letters. Money was tight during the Great Depression in the area. Grimes saved for retirement and spent little. He saw changes everywhere. New tech exists. New theories about reality and science emerged, but the valleys remained a mystery. Young college student Richard Foster visited Grimes in 1937. Foster read Peyton's book for his Appalachian folklore thesis. He requested permission to tell Grimes about his life. Grimes agreed, knowing the importance of passing on. He taught the next generation while alive. Several weeks of interviews were held that summer. Foster recorded the conversations with a new wire recorder. He overheard Grimes talking about old memories. After being transcribed and preserved, these recordings provided details and nuances missing from written reports. Grimes' voice was deep despite the basic recording technology. Being emotionally invested in the case, persistent and humble before the mystery. In one of these meetings, Foster asked Grimes if he regretted his investigation and what he would change. It took Grimes a while to answer. He said he could have done better if he had been more honest from the start about the unclear parts of the case and less worried about looking bad, unreliable, or superstitious. He may have missed opportunities to investigate parts of the phenomenon that didn't fit into established categories because he was following criminal investigation rules. However, he said he did the best he could with the knowledge and tools he had. He couldn't blame himself for not having answers that others may not have had. Understandable way. He insisted that telling the truth about what he saw and experienced was honorable, even if it couldn't be explained. Grimes's health deteriorated severely in fall 1938. Doctors said his breathing problems were caused by his advanced age and years in the harsh mountain conditions. He died at home, where neighbors and friends cared for him and preserved his life's records. Public service and truth-seeking. Walter Grimes died peacefully in his sleep on December 23, 1938. His age was 85. Madison County residents and others attended his funeral to pay their respects. The new sheriff, Daniel Whitlock, praised Grimes's police work and dedication to solving the missing persons case in a speech. The weak and unsteady peon made the trip. They attended after decades of knowing a friend and collaborator had died. Walter Grimes' 1938 death ended a Madison County era. The lifelong mystery he tried to solve failed. His meticulously organized and kept records are now a valuable resource for researchers, historians, and those curious about the inexplicable. Unopened 50 years after his death, his letter was sealed in the county records, anticipating 1988. Many decades after Grimes' death, the world changed in ways he never imagined. World War II destroyed many things and enabled new technology. The atomic age, space race, and computer revolution began. From quantum to cosmological, science advanced greatly, solving the universe's mysteries. However, North Carolina's 3 Appalachian valleys remained unchanged, as mysterious as ever. Nathaniel Peyton died in 1942, leaving decades of Appalachian strangeness knowledge. However, future researchers often find his book. A young student interviewed Grimes and became an anthropology professor. Some of his fieldwork examined how remote communities learn about and remember their environment through stories and oral history. People got lost in Grimes areas in the 1950s and 1960s when mountain tourism grew and more tourists from outside the area visited. Most of them were found quickly, lost but safe. Some needed larger search and rescue operations, and in 1953 and 1967, 2 people disappeared without a trace, a disturbing repeat of a pattern. One of these victims was a man breaking the pattern of only women being victims. He had. A New York wildlife photographer photographed mountain plants and animals. His camera gear was found on a trail, carefully set up as if he had taken a break and would return, but he never did. No more clues after much searching. The valleys appeared to have killed someone, indicating that time and progress had not satisfied their strange hunger. Finally, Grimes' letter was opened in public, 1988, 50 years after his death, as requested. Local officials, historians, and descendants of missing families attended the event. A county historical society member read the letter. His 50-year-old words echoed throughout the room. Grimes addressed that audience in the future and hoped that scientific advances would provide answers to his questions. He begged that if this hadn't happened, future generations would still write about, observe, and respect the valley's mysteries. He stressed that we must remember the victims, honor their memories, and remember that they were real people whose lives were tragically cut short by forces we can't understand. The letter's beginning revived interest in the case. Marshall had local and national reporters investigating the story. Some took it seriously, others not. Skeptical of sensationalism. Because of this, Grimes's work reached more people than he thought possible in his lifetime. People who wanted to investigate the case had a lot of information because he carefully documented everything. The disappearances in North Carolina's Appalachian Mountains were revived online in the 1990s and early 1920s as more people went online. Unsolved mystery forums discussed the case. Lots of it. Some people had complex ideas about dimensional portals or alien visitors. People who disagreed said there must be undiscovered logical reasons. Grimes's records were digitized and made public by the local historical society. These records provided a solid factual foundation for informed discussion. Geologists took new valley measurements with tools Grimes could only dream of. They expanded and confirmed Edward Moss's learned. The magnetic anomalies mattered. Strange underground mineral formations likely caused them. These differences may affect the vestibular system or brain electrical activity, causing severe disorientation, according to some researchers. This contributed to missing people, but it didn't explain everything. The case interested psychologists and neuroscientists, especially Dorothy's stories. Ashwood and others on sense of reality change. Recent research suggests that strong magnetic fields, natural infrasound, and volcano gases can cause hallucinations. Some researchers believe that the valleys were places where many environmental factors combined to change how people saw things. This made people feel lost and moved to safer, more remote areas. They lost to the elements. These explanations had flaws despite their plausibility. They didn't explain the body shortage. They didn't understand why disappearances happened in vague cycles. It wasn't clear why they mostly affected women, but it may have been due to the types of people who walked alone in those areas in the past. More than 100 years later, the three valleys in Madison County's Appalachian Mountains remain after Beatrice Lowe disappeared. Locals avoid them because they follow old traditions. Sometimes, curious tourists or determined researchers visit. In recent years, small but clear signs have been posted in some areas to warn people to be careful because they have lost people. The local government keeps Grimes' records for future use, and search and rescue teams have been trained in those areas' operations. What happened to Beatrice Lowe that October 1917 morning is unknown. She may have crossed an invisible line between worlds, been lost by natural forces, or suffered a terrible fate we can't imagine. This goes for Clara Whitfield, Rebecca Hayes, Margaret Sullivan, and all the other women Walter Grimes carefully recorded. But theirs. Grimes's dedication to writing and refusing to forget the inexplicable was profound. He knew some questions may not have answers, at least not with the information we have now. His insistence on asking these questions, seeing and writing down mysteries, remembering victims, and keeping mountain secrets persisted. They've done this for millennia and will continue. More. We can only know so much about these old landscapes because we are passing through them briefly. Maybe we should know these limits, be respectful and careful in the unknown, and remember the stories and warnings we've heard over the years. The Valley Mysteries and Beatrice Lowe case may never be solved, thanks to Walter Grimes, who preserved records and testimonies, and the stories are passed down from generation to generation. They show us that reality is stranger than our beliefs, that reality seems to follow different rules in some places, and that humility when you don't know what's going on is wise. If this story touched you or made you curious about our world's mysteries, subscribe to this channel. There are many more stories like this need to be told. Mysterious cases and centuries-old mysteries. Share your thoughts on the Beatrice Lowe case, or if you know of any similar cases in your area. If you enjoyed this in-depth look at one of the scariest cases in U.S. history, please click like so more people can find these intriguing and terrifying stories. Thanks for taking us through time and the Appalachians to solve a mystery. Resonates for generations. We'll explore our lives' forgotten and unexplained stories until next time.